Thank you, Lars. Also, a huge thank you to ECHO for always organizing these webinars in a fantastic way. Also, thank you to all speakers who have agreed to come today and be with us. And also on behalf of ICANN, welcome to everyone who has joined today. I will kick off with some statistics. So this was the third ICANN meeting we held in India. And as we all know, there are some geopolitical issues with the region. So we definitely were less people than we had anticipated. Still, we were over 1,400 in-person participants. And these 1,400 plus participants represented 112 countries and territories. So I still think it was a nice representation of regions. We also had over 660 online participants. So if you look at it together, we were well over 2,000 people who participated in some way. In total, we had 203 public sessions. We had a number of plenaries, and I will not go into all of them, but I'd like to highlight at least one of them, and that was the one on ICANN's role in the future of internet resilience. This was a cross-community plenary where we basically looked into what vulnerabilities there are that could lead to a major outage, and we tried to define steps on how to mitigate that. That was one of the more interesting plenaries, I think. Once a year, we also hand out the Community Excellence Award. This is an award that goes to a community member that has worked cross-community-wise to strengthen the internet, the multi-stake, and it's awarded by an independent panel that is comprised by the SONCs and AC representatives. And this year, when the Community Excellence Award went to Amrita Choudhury, I hope I pronounced her name correct. She's the chair of AP RALO, which is the at-large regional organization for Asia and Asia Pacific. And she also is the co-founder of the India School of Internet Governance. And finally, last but not least, I'd like to highlight one important board decision, which we find important, and that's that the board approved the standard registry agreement, which basically means that the registries that will be approved as new GTLD registries now have this agreement that defines the rights and obligations and responsibilities of this new top-level domain. And that was all from my end, so I'm happy to hand over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabi. It was great. Thomas Rickard here. And let me briefly add to what you said, that the meeting was organized in a brilliant fashion in Mumbai. So big shout out to the hosts and the organizing teams. So that's awesome. It was a pleasure. For today, we have a couple of important topics on our plate. And I hope that we can get through all of them, because I'm sure that all of the speakers and the groups that they represent had quite, maybe at times, heated discussions on how we should navigate these topics. But let's dive straight into it. And I would like to ask the speakers to keep it as brief as possible. So the first topic that we're going to cover is DNS abuse. And the first speaker to introduce the topic is going to be Susan Payne, who's the GNSO chair. And she will start with some thoughts on the procedural side of things before we then go into substance and have a list of other speakers that would like to chime in. Susan, over to you.
Thanks very much, Thomas. Yes, so we had a bit of a landmark really at the ICANN 85 meeting with the commencement of the first of what's hopefully a series of policy development processes, or PDPs, looking at tackling aspects of DNS abuse in the GTLD space. So this arose out of some work that a council small team did to pull together a list of potential issues relating to DNS abuse that might be addressed. And that itself formed the basis of what's called an issues report, which is where ICANN staff examine the issue in more detail and review it for things like whether it's within the scope of ICANN's mission, whether it's something that would be suitable for handling via a policy development of new policy, or whether it might be an issue that maybe is better addressed in some other means. But the issues report is essentially the kind of first step to a PDP. And following that issues report, there were really 3 issues that were prioritized to be taken forward initially. And the first of these, which now forms the DNS abuse PDP1, is the one dealing with what's called associated domain checks. And basically what that is, seeking to create an obligation for registrars to proactively investigate other domains associated with the customer account or the registrant for a domain, where a domain has been identified as having been registered maliciously and for use in perpetrating DNS abuse as it's defined in the Registrar Accreditation Agreement. And so the idea is then that it will create this kind of proactive obligation to look at other domains in the same account, basically, to see whether there are other sort of potentially malicious domains there. And in doing that work, I think the PDP group are expected to look at things, some issues like what's the scope, what would trigger an associated domain check, what do we mean by associated domains in terms of visit accounts or registrant details or whatever, taking into account the fact that there are different business models for registrars, things like what might be the minimum procedural requirements or proposed timelines for doing these checks, and clarifying some of the obligations around things like evidence gathering and confidentiality and so on. And also in doing that work, the working group is expected to take into consideration things like the impact on the global public interest, human rights, data protection. Those are all matters which are now built into all PDP efforts that the group should think about. I should say, before I hand over to others, one of the early tasks for this working group, and so when they have their kickoff meetings in Mumbai, the working group is expected to develop a work plan and timeline. And so a draft was put forward to the group for consideration. And ultimately, once it's signed off by the working group, it will then come to the GNSOCAT for us to approve. But I would say the draft timeline certainly did trigger a fair amount of discussion across the meeting. It currently, in the draft form, envisages a timeline of about 18 months from start to finish for this PDP work. And it's safe to say that some felt that is too long a period. And so there was a bit of feedback around that. But I think it's also, there are a couple of things to bear in mind. Firstly, obviously, speed is important, but it is also important that the work is done properly and that the outputs from this working group are robust and workable and implementable and so on. So there are other factors besides speed. And also it's worth bearing in mind that there are a certain number of steps in a PDP process that kind of are fairly fixed. So one of the key ones is that there would be an initial report and that gets put out to public comment for usually 6 weeks. And then when the comment from the wider community is received, the working group is obviously expected to review all of that and consider whether anything new has been raised and whether anything needs to be changed in the recommendations. And so whilst there's certainly a lot of call for trying to speed this process up where possible, there are also some steps that are really quite important for ensuring that the output is robust and workable and implementable, that one wouldn't want to shorten unduly. But in any event, there hopefully there will be some opportunities for, in doing the work, for the working group to perhaps not take all the time that's been earmarked for their potential deliberations before we get to the initial report. And there may be a bit of time that can be saved at the point where it comes into the GNSO Council for approval, whereby if council are keeping good track of the work as it's going along and are able to act promptly, we may be able to save a few weeks or a month or so at that sort of stage as well. So I think I'll pause there and maybe allow others to have an input.
Yeah, let's do that. So we have a list of speakers, and the first is Sarah. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, friends. Hello, this is Sarah Wild. As mentioned, I'm the Vice Chair for Policy of the Registrar Stakeholder Group. I work at Tucows in Toronto, Canada, and I'm really happy to be here with you today. So on this topic of associated domain checks, I have two main thoughts to share with you. The first is that many registrars are already doing these associated domain checks in various forms today. So this work here is really about learning from those current practices, formalizing those processes, and then determining the best path forward to expand those requirements and processes to all ICANN accredited registrars. The other thing that we should all be aware of is that doing associated domain checks is a complex and highly contextual process, and it's really crucial to get it right to avoid collateral damage, as well as to respect data privacy and human rights. So one of the sessions at ICANN 85 presented example scenarios of confirmed DNS abuse with information about associated domains and had the attendees consider what to do in each situation. Can we take action? Is there enough information? What kind of action would be taken? What would be appropriate? And it really showed that the decision about what to do in each situation depends very much on the specific facts of each case at hand. The best approach is not always the same approach every time. So that was a really good session, and I think it surfaced some of those important questions or considerations. I wanted to post a link in the chat. It looks like I can't send it to everybody, but I think Thomas is going to do so. Or you can just go to the 85 schedule and look for CSI ICANN. That was the session I'm referring to. And yeah, so that's what I had to share on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I think we can't easily send links to the entire group, but the kind folks at ECHO will take care of that or make that link available to everyone via email after this webinar. So thanks for pointing that out. And Beth, are you already with us?
This is Beth Bacon. I'm with the Public Interest Registry. I'm also the chair of the registry stakeholder group. I apologize for not having video on. It's a bit of a public service. I'm under the weather. No one wants to see that. So I think with the DNS abuse PDP, from the registry stakeholder group perspective, we're just really pleased with the progress. I think that the group did a lot of really good preparation, and we are narrow on the charter. The scoping is appropriate. Everyone is very invested in making sure that this is, as Susan said, not only efficient, but done well and right. So I think we're on a great path to get this done within probably under the proposed timeline. The registries are obviously taking a little bit of a deferral to the registrars because a lot of this work will fall to the registrars, but registries do have a stake in this game as well. So we are trying to be active and supportive and really looking forward to digging into ADC and then getting into the next PDPs that are going to be in this series.
Thank you so much. I think we can then move to Frederic.
Thank you, Thomas. Frederic Da speaking, chair of EuroLaw, so the European at-large organization representing end-user interest. We are heavily involved and deeply in DNS abuse. What was mentioned, we have an expert link that insists on the difficulties for end users to balance the rights to privacy and anonymity on the internet. To mention on top of all what was already said about PDP, ACIS, which is the ELAC Committee on Engagement and Subcommittee, developed a training on phishing. It is complementary, but it's important to create awareness about phishing. It's a train-the-trainer material video has been developed and ready to be localized. So I invite also you to, we can share the link after this meeting. This material is ready to be used to create awareness on the community. Another one is trust.com, developed by EuroLaw ALS, also in collaboration with many people from ICANN. And there is also behind a master thesis on the trustworthiness on domain names, also with the purpose to bring awareness for the end users about how domain names are working, who is behind domain names. And the tool is also available free and open source. And that were a few initiatives I want to mention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frederic. Jordan, over to you.
Thanks, Thomas, and hi all. My name is Jordan Carter. I am one of the vice chairs of the CCNSO Council. So nice to be joining this readout. And my day job is working for the Australian Domain Administration. So it's a glorious 3 a.m. here in Melbourne at the moment. I just wanted to make a couple of comments about the CCNSO or the CCTLD dynamic here, because a lot of the CC managers go a little bit beyond the ICANN definition in dealing with DNS abuse. There's a lot of dialogue recently in the CCNSO's Domain Abuse Standing Committee, DNS Abuse Standing Committee, or called DAC, about, for example, looking at how financial scams work, as well as working on the traditional factors in the ICANN definition as recently agreed in the contract amendments. And so what that means is that as a participant, a member of the PDP that's going on, we bring a wide body of case studies of the way things can be done. And so there's an existence proof of whether particular challenges can be tackled or particular approaches to things like associated domain checks can actually work. And there's also some scale proofs as well. Some of the CCTLDs are quite large, have millions or 10 million plus domain name registrations. So what we hope, I think, to bring through the participation in the PDPs is a set of insights from operational practice in very diverse geographic operational scale settings that we hope will just help the process along. So I think I'll just leave that introductory comment there. It's great to see this process moving in the GNSO. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jordan, for your input and also for accepting the sacrifice and joining us in the middle of the night, your time. Nico.
Hello, everyone. I'm based in Asunción with a beautiful 29 degrees Celsius. It's 1 p.m. here. So I'll be very brief for the GAC, and thank you for the opportunity. As a GAC chair, I can say that for the GAC, DNS abuse mitigation remains a top priority. In Mumbai, we basically focus heavily on the need for speed and proactive measures. We were particularly impressed by the .in India's registries policies and the work of the trusted notifier network. While we're encouraged by the start of the GNSO policy process on associated domain checks, the GAC is basically pushing for a shorter overall timeline. A critical point for us is the current 15-day window for registrar verification. We strongly believe, the GAC strongly believes that registrant information should be actually verified before a domain becomes accessible, as studies show that this can decrease malicious registrations by 70%. According to the numbers. And I stand to be corrected, and we would be very happy to be corrected, but that's the information we have so far. And we also continue to call for a centralized reporting mechanism managed by ICANN to improve transparency. And let me stop there in order not to make this too long. So again, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Nico, and great input. And I'm so tempted to dive into a discussion on how this can be done, but we should probably let the working group do its work. But I'd like to make a few remarks before we move to the next topic, just because we know that there are a lot of attendees to these webinars, but also folks that watch the webinar later that might not be too familiar with ICANN's processes and the way ICANN works. So let me refresh everyone's memory on what we're talking about. So DNS abuse in the ICANN world means phishing, farming, malware, botnets, and spam to the extent that it's used as a distribution mechanism to advertise the 4 categories of bad behavior that I mentioned above. So it's not content-related things and other types of abuse, bad things that we see on the internet, but ICANN, due to its limited technical mandate, has chosen a pretty narrow definition of DNS abuse in order not to step over the line and do things that are not covered by its mandate according to ICANN's bylaws. Then, Susan mentioned that the current proposal on the table in terms of timeline is 18 months. And you might think, what the heck, 18 months for a topic such as this? But let's just put this into perspective. The PDP lifecycle that ICANN is using, that gives the process an awful lot of legitimacy with public comment periods and stuff like that, allows for a minimum period of 12 to 30 months. So that's basically the shortest possible time that we can deliver a consensus policy in. So I know that the working group is keen on, and there's pressure from other groups, including the Governmental Advisory Committee, to maybe shave off a couple of weeks or months from the 18 months that have been proposed. But let's just be realistic. 18 months is already good for a PDP. And if we can get closer to the 12 or 13 months, that would be almost to the shortest period of time that ICANN's processes allow for. Then let me remind you that during a PDP process, there's an opportunity for stakeholders to provide early input. And if I'm not mistaken, the deadline for providing that early stakeholder input is the 20th of March. So you have 2 more days. And I think it's important for all of you that are working with their respective groups to provide as much input as possible, because the better informed the PDP working group can start its work, the better it can come to consensus and good recommendations. And one plea, if I may, the initial timeline is just until the GNSO Council submits the recommendations to the board. So what I would hope is that the board processes the recommendations coming out of the GNSO as fast as possible. I know that's not always feasible, but we are making it a priority in the GNSO community. And I hope that the board will also make it a priority. And I'm now looking at Nico. I think it's also important for the GAC to provide its input as early as possible so that we don't experience any surprises with GAC advice coming in after the GNSO has done its work and when it's with the board. So I think if we're all conservative in our criticism, let's say, if we're all as comprehensive with our input, I think we can hopefully come up with a set of recommendations that cover a lightweight approach that will hopefully make a difference, that is not too complicated, that's easy for every registrar around the world and maybe registry as well to incorporate. I see that Sarah has raised her hand. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you so much. This is Sarah, and I'll be brief because I know we're trying to move to another topic. I just wanted to pick up on that 15-day window for verification that Nico mentioned. Changing that time frame would have a really significant adverse effect on the majority of domain registrants because they're using their domains for legitimate and reasonable purposes. So I'm not sure. Before any such change would be made, I do think that we would need more research. We need more information. I know that Nico shared a stat, but I'm not really clear on what that's based on. And I do think that there's room to gather more information there. And I think now is a good time to be doing that information gathering. I would also emphasize that for the current PDP and the others that are already planned to happen in sequence, this topic is not yet part of that work for those planned PDPs. So if the working group is going to be able to achieve that really short timeline, which as Thomas emphasized, it's quite brief already, then it's really important for that team to remain within the scope of the work that's laid out for them. So on that topic, I think maybe now is the time for research rather than for actual change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Let's now move to the next topic, and that is TCCM. And the first speaker on that is going to be Beth. And maybe to start with, you can enlighten everyone on what that acronym actually means.
Thanks, Thomas. This is Beth Bacon again. I don't know how you wouldn't just be able to figure that out. It's so easy. TCCM. It stands for a Technical Community Coalition for Multi-Stakeholderism, hence the acronym. The TCCM was formed last year, maybe a year and a half ago, and we did that to bring together the technical community in preparation to engage in the Global Digital Compact as well, and then the follow-on WSIS Plus 20 process review. We started with maybe a core group of maybe 5 to 8 members, and I think we've grown to, Jordan can correct me because he's very active in this as well, I think we're at 40 something at this point, and it's a global membership of technical operators, including RIRs, registries, registrars, and other technical infrastructure layer folks. And we were formed to engage in the WSIS Plus 20 process to ensure continued support from governments for the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance, as well as furtherance of the mission, the mandate for the IGF, and overall, just making sure that we have a voice in the process, which is very challenging considering the WSIS Plus 20 is a UN process and governments have a place there, but not necessarily non-members. So we are happy to say we spent ICANN 85 celebrating our wins in that area. The WSIS Plus 20 process was very successful. Thank you very much to all of our government partners who were so open to input and cooperation and collaboration with us. We were able to all together reaffirm support for the multi-stakeholder model and a renewed mandate for the IGF, which is spectacular. We spent the rest of ICANN figuring out what's next for TCCM. We do plan on not being quite as active simply because we don't have a WSIS going on, but we do have focus areas of continuing our engagement and active collaboration with ICANN and their work within internet governance organizations to ensure that we keep that technical community voice alive. And then also there is the ITU Plentypot that's coming up and the IGF as well. So those are going to be our 3 focus areas, and we look forward to engaging with anyone who is interested in the work that we're doing. And as we move forward into the new year and the next few years on those kind of 3 topic focus areas. And I will apologize to folks. Jordan is here to answer questions. I do have to hop off. It's a little bit late for me, and not quite as late as Jordan. He's a trooper. But I do apologize, and I appreciate everyone's time, and thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much, Beth, and get well soon. Jordan, would you like to chime in?
Sure. Thanks, Thomas, and thanks, Beth, for that intro. Beth has covered the substance of it. I'll just give a little bit more context on why the coalition came about. This global internet governance stuff at the international level is quite hard to track. And so what we were looking for was to build a coalition where we could share the burden of tracking and engaging in these processes more broadly. So it isn't that the secretariat of the coalition, TCCM, is all volunteers from various organizations. It isn't an organization itself. It doesn't have a constitution or bylaws or rules or anything. It's a kind of very light, informal collaboration structure. And it isn't one where there's extensive policy development processes. It's quite light touch. And as Beth mentioned as well, absent the rush of the sort of deadline with an intergovernmental negotiation on the future of internet governance, and which could have shaped CAN, the IGF, and so on, this year is a little bit less intense. So for infrastructure operators who wanted to collaborate on those issues, it's a good vehicle. It isn't replacing the role of any of the existing things. It's not a new ISTAR. It isn't seeking to replace any existing party. It was just born of an insight that collaborating together makes it easier to track some of these processes that are outside the direct day-to-day work of organizations like ICANN, and that we wanted to make sure that the voice of that diverse set of technical operators, there were about 44 or 45 members from every continent around the world, were brought to the table in those debates. And this year, as Beth mentioned, taking the now permanent IGF and trying to strengthen and improve it, dealing with the risks that may emerge from the ITU's plenipotentiary process as it moves towards the plenipotentiary conference at the end of the year, and tracking what's going on at ICANN are the three areas of focus. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Jordan. We can now move to the next topic, and that's the next round of new GTLDs. So I will call upon Frederick in 1 second. Nico, there was a question in the chat with respect to the study that you referred to with the 70%. I suggest that we move on, talk about the next round, and if you could kindly put into the chat what study you were referring to, we can then share it with the wider group of attendees. Frederick, please.
Thank you, Thomas. Frederick speaking. Quite a challenge to talk about the next round of GTLD. It's the application guidebook is more than 400 pages. I would like to summarize really what is new here. So the GTLDs are the 3 letters and more top-level domain extensions. It was quite a limited number for decades. Then we had a good round of GTLD in 2012 with 1,200 new top-level domains. And now it's the new round since, so a high pressure from the market with different domain names, extensions for the brands, geographical locations, communities, etc. So what's new here? First, we gain a lot in terms of maturity. Maturity with the predictability framework for any issues that unexpected that could be raised during the process. We are also much more stronger in terms of privacy data protection, a topic which was much less addressed 15 years ago. Also a contention resolution framework that's really exciting. I will just take one example. I'm living close to a city called Waterloo, so Waterloo in French, and it gives a good highlight. We could have a battle of Waterloo here on the internet. Why? Because there are 127 cities called Waterloo all over the world. So if one wants to have the name of Waterloo, how to manage it? And we have also brands having Waterloo. We can have sparkling water, beers, bathroom. It's also Waterloo brand. We even have a community, the Waterloo Connection. So all communities using Waterloo a name around the world, but they have no money. So what is new here? There is also an applicant support program that was launched 2024, a lower prices for communities, because the base tickets to apply for new GTLD is $227,000 US. That's quite a big amount of money. With this ISP program, the applicant can have a rebate up to 75% or 85%. We had remarks from the community, especially from Africa, that can still be a high amount of money. If you have even a big rebate, is still about $60,000. That's really a significant amount of money. And how the money will come is not only through the auctions, because there is, if you have different, we're winning the same domain name, we'll have auctions, and the money from the auctions will be used also for the applicant support program, which was quite a success. 40 were expected, and there are 74. 12 have been already processed and 62 under processing. So that gives some ideas. A new thing also in this new round of GTLD is the split between really the GTLD application for the name and the label from the technical side. So the technical assessment is really now aside in parallel with the registry service providers evaluation. And there are some already assessed in a previous exercise about 1 year ago. And pretty soon, new service providers being evaluated on how they do operate technically, the DNS, and with new criteria as DNSSEC. So that's really a huge improvement also for the more than the technical stability and the progress. And last but not least, is internationalized domain names. The alphabets are not limited to Latin. It's really 27 different alphabets are supported. Just name a few ones here. It's Arabic, we have a Chinese Han, we have Japanese, we have Cyrillic, we have Hebrew, and many more. There is a slide, how to say that attention points raised by Quebec. There is already the .Quebec, and we have .Quebec with an accent, and that was not taken into account and not ready yet now for the applicant guidebook. The PDP is expected to, so the policy development process to be ready by October this year, and if approved, can be implemented by mid next year. And important to mention is about the timeline. So the timeline starts in April, that the applicant will be open to submit. The precise date is not yet there. Hopefully not the April 1st, more the April 30, and for duration of 12 to 15 weeks. Then 8 weeks after the evaluation period of all candidates, we'll have a reveal day where all names will be revealed. And the applicants will have the possibility to switch and to replace the string. So in the application, they can provide, okay, that is our main string we want, but we have also some alternates. And we will have at that time the string confirmation day. Afterwards, we have different constituencies, the GAC, application comments, objections, with 104 days to come with remark or objections about the strings. We'll have also checks between singular, plural. Many things has been, how to say that, developed, string evaluation, the similarities between the names and the options finally. If there are different candidates having both the right, I would say, to have some top-level domains. So the total duration of this program will not be only this year, and I can mention that it could roll out over the next years, over duration up to 4 years. And for more information, we are also URL organizing a roundtable on the next round of GTLD, the 31 of March, so end of this month. So that was a high-level introduction about all the news, and the floor is open to some other comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frederic. Nico, I know that you want to talk about new GTLDs as well, right?
That's correct. But before we get to the new GTLD, the next round of GTLDs, I just wanted to go back to the question. You repeat the question so that I can address it.
Sure. You refer to a study according to which 70%, I think it was, you mentioned.
Yeah, that's the Infermal study. The Infermal, I don't remember the acronym, but Infermal study. As the Infermal study notes, when the validation of registrant information takes place during the account creation or before the domain purchase, it is associated with a 70% decrease in malicious registrations. And you can find that reference on page 9 of the GAC communique that is publicly available on the website. So, but I don't think we have time to talk about the Infermal. But again, that's the reference, the Infermal study. So please go ahead and take it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nico. That certainly rings a bell with those who are interested in that topic. If we have time at the end of the session, I suggest we go back to this topic, or we pick it up at the next webinar, because there are different views that are being held on how to deal with deferred delegation and how that impacts the industry as such, and what the benefits actually are. Some players use a risk-based approach, so they don't take all domain name registrations hostage. They basically determine what domain name registrations might potentially carry a higher risk. But there's a lot of nuance to that. But we would like to hear now from you what the GAC's view is on the next round and what topics you are
very happy
discussing.
Very happy to do so. So, as regarding the next round, the GAC is closely tracking readiness efforts as we approach the next month, April 26th launch. We are very encouraged to see that 75 applications for the applicant support program from all 5 regions, according to the last numbers I remember at this point. We fully support using the 2012 round proceeds to fund all qualified applicants, but we insist that this expansion must not reduce the 85% base fee reduction originally promised. We are also carefully reviewing the TLD application management system, the TAMS, if I recall correctly, and we have asked ICANN.org for dedicated sessions to ensure that members can efficiently access the public information needed for our reviews and potentially early warnings. So, and I'll stop there for the sake of time.
Thank you so much. Anyone else on new GTLDs?
Yes, we have a hand from Susan.
All right, Susan.
Yes, thank you. I was just going to make a quick plug, really, for the recordings from ICANN 85 of the various sort of informational sessions that ICANN staff ran about the next round. And there were 5 or 6 of them, and they covered different aspects. Colleagues of mine who attended those sessions found them very useful. I think the staff also felt they were very well received. They were a really good opportunity to dig into particular issues and for people to ask questions and seek clarification. And so I wanted to flag those as being really useful resources for anyone who's thinking about applying or thinking about working with applicants. And also, Frederick will be disappointed to hear that in addition to the 400 pages of the AGB, there are also a large number of frequently asked questions that are being produced by ICANN staff as well, that go to give more information to help interpret what the guidebook says. So I'm afraid it's not just 400 pages, unfortunately. There are also these FAQs that I think, again, for those who are thinking about working in this space and putting applications in, you will find them hopefully very helpful.
I think, Susan, if you add to the applicant guidebook the consensus policies, the registry agreement, and you might be closer to 1,000 pages that you need to be familiar with. I did the math last time around, and I got well over 1,000 pages of documents to be read. Do we have anyone else that wants to speak to UGTLDs? If not, then by way of shameless self-promotion, I'd like to point you to the new GTLD provider directory that Lars has built on the ECHO website for those who are interested in applying for their TLDs. It's not just a list with companies that can help as a registry service provider, as a registrar that you might need to work with, or as a consultant, but we have videos. If you are not afraid of looking at my face for a little longer, we have a couple of videos with representatives of various companies, but also written interviews so that you can actually learn more about the companies and whether you can identify a company that you would like to work with, because we thought that is easier accessible than just trying to navigate your way by searching the internet. Lars has kindly shared the link in the chat, so please take a look at that. Let's now talk about ASSET, the standard system for access and disclosure. We had a couple of recommendations on that, and Sarah will enlighten us on the destiny of those recommendations.
So yes, as Tomas said, there were recommendations from the EPDP for GTLD registration data phase 2 to build a standardized system for access and disclosure of GTLD registration data. And those recommendations, I think maybe there's 18 of them, they've been with the ICANN board to consider for quite some time now, for good reason. There's been a lot of pieces moving here. But at the board's meeting in Mumbai, they have now decided not to adopt these recommendations to build the ASSET, and that's great. this does not mean that the work stops here. No, what it means is now the GNSO Council, likely with a group of subject matter experts, will work out supplemental recommendations to move the whole work forward. And so this means that councillors will go through each of the existing recommendations from the Phase 2 EPDP, along with the input from the RDRS Standing Committee, which did exactly that kind of recommendation review, and an alignment analysis of related policies provided by ICANN.org. So this new team will look through all of that documentation, all of those recommendations and suggestions, and figure out what kinds of changes might be needed now to make this package of recommendations workable for implementation. So from the registrar stakeholder group perspective, we are ready to work on this. I personally am excited. I'd like to be on that team. We think that the RDRS was a really successful pilot project. And so I know I've talked about SSAD, but the RDRS was an information gathering pilot, a mini version, a lightweight system that had some of the SSAD functionality, but not all of it, to understand what's the volume, what's the process like. And that worked. That did gather the information that I think was useful. And so now it's time to figure out the long term. So ideally, I would say that any centralized system should remain voluntary for registrars to participate in. But I know that what was recommended for the SSAD was indeed a mandatory system. And either way, regardless, improvements should be made in line with those standing committees' outputs, including a way to direct requests to non-participating registrars if applicable. But also, really importantly, there's financial sustainability that has not yet been implemented. And so that would be looking at billing for the users of the system, the requesters, to make sure that the system does operate in a sustainable manner. So there are, as I said, recommendations to be reviewed, and it's a big piece of work, but I think ultimately we can come out with something that is useful, that is helpful to the requesters, as well as for registrars who have the data to be able to process those requests in an efficient manner that does, again, respect the data privacy rights of domain owners. Yeah,
Thank
so
you
I
so
hope
much.
that's a helpful review. I feel like I talked really fast. I'm sorry about that. Thank you.
Great information. Thank you so much, Sarah. Does anyone else wish to speak to that topic?
Thomas, it's Susan here. I could just
Thank you.
add a little bit, but
Yeah.
yeah, I was just going to say, Sarah has really covered this, so there isn't a great deal for me to add, but really just to say that the GNSO Council have had already a few preliminary conversations with the members of the board caucus that deal with sort of data, registration data issues. And that resulted in a kind of agreement that the path forward to do this work would be this supplemental recommendation path. And so that led to non-adoption by the board of the original SSAD policy recommendations. But just to reiterate, really, that's not about lack of commitment on the board or org side to deal with this. It doesn't mean those recommendations and all of the community work that went into them are being thrown away. It really is a kind of a process that's set out in an annex to the ICANN bylaws that deals with what happens, and it triggers a kind of process of engagement with the board and then a work effort that is the GNSO Council is tasked with. And although the council is tasked with that effort of coming up with the supplemental recommendations, the likelihood, as Sarah was saying, is that in addition to any councillors who want to work on this, probably will have some kind of a working group structure that includes other members of the wider community, some representatives from the various different constituencies and stakeholder groups, and some of the other interested parties like the GAC and the at-large to really work on this. So the exact kind of group structure of taking this work forward is still to be agreed. But I think what we're all clear on is that it is important that this work goes forward with a reasonable group of the appropriate expertise, and that there is the necessary transparency of operations. So the idea that it would be important to allow for observers, that there should be all the usual stuff, open mailing lists, ability to observe calls, that kind of thing, to ensure that this work isn't going on in secret, but that we do have a kind of a good community effort to come up with a kind of policy that aligns better with that RDRS system than the previous much more complex system that the SSAD was envisaging. So hopefully it doesn't cause concern about those policy recommendations have been rejected. It really is a kind of bylaws process that gets triggered for taking the work back and doing some more work.
Thanks so much, Susan. Anyone else? Nico, please go ahead.
Very quickly on this topic, and for the sake of time, I'll be very brief. We provided input under section 4B, that's more precisely page 8 of the GAC communique, which is publicly available again. So we have our opinion in writing in an official way there. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you so much, Nico. And Lars has kindly put the link to the GAC communique into the chat, as well as a link to the provider directory that I mentioned earlier. Just to finish on the topic of the SSAD recommendations, this is work that needs to be done in the aftermath of the EPDP. And let's remember, E stands for expedited. So that's funny but the thing is, and I think that's important to remember, the ASAD recommendations were part of the outcome. One part was the new registration data policy that is now in effect. But the other aspect was the creation or the definition of parameters for a system for access and disclosure. And I think that the EPDP team at the time has done an excellent job in coming up with a pretty sophisticated system with all the safeguards in place to avoid that registration data is in jeopardy, that unlawful access to that can be granted in all these things. But then ICANN.org did this operational design phase and found out that the implementation, according to ICANN.org's studies, would cost more than, I think, 120 million USD, which then led ICANN.org to build the smaller brother or the smaller sister, however you might call it, which is the RDRS that Sarah referred to. That's just a referral system, right? And folks have criticized it for not having sufficient functionality, but basically all the functionality, the full enchilada of the ASAD recommendations was too expensive to build. So I think it will be on the small team or wherever the composition of that team might be to find the sweet spot between a set of recommendations that is affordable to implement, whilst making it a really useful tool for the global community that wishes to use it and needs to get access to non-public registration data. So that's just to give you a little bit of context on where we are, and I hope that this group can do its work in the very, very near future. Let's now talk about the review of reviews, which is another strange species that we've created. So we not only have reviews, but now we're even reviewing how we're doing reviews. And Philippe Foucault will kindly enlighten us on how that's going to work and where we stand on that topic. Philippe, please. Philippe says he can't unmute, but you appear to be unmuted here. So I suggest that you work that out in the background while we go to Susan to talk about human rights, because that's an increasing topic of debate in the ICANN world recently.
Yes, indeed. There was quite a lot of discussion on human rights during the meeting. And indeed, there often is. I think this all really stems from changes that came in 2016 to the ICANN bylaws, where there has been included in the bylaws since then a human rights core value that calls for respecting internationally recognized human rights as required by applicable law. And this is supported by a framework of interpretation for human rights that ICANN now has, that gives some guidelines on how that core value in the bylaws should be put into practice. And so at a GNSO level, what has been done is that the GNSO has now incorporated a consideration of human rights impacts into its PDP processes, so that all new PDPs, including the DNS abuse PDP-1 that we were talking about earlier, they're now expected to consider what might be the human rights implications, as well as other implications like the global public interest and data protection implications. So what those implications from the new policy that's being developed might be, although it's really for the kind of individual working group to determine how best they structure that effort. So during our meeting, the GNSO Council meeting with the GAC during ICANN 85, we did raise this issue of human rights impact assessments in the context of PDPs and the importance of early identification of issues, and asked whether GAC members might consider bringing in their respective relevant expertise to assist with those kind of assessments if and where appropriate. And I'd say in response, I think we heard a fairly positive response from the GAC, emphasizing the importance of considering the full suite of human rights when conducting an impact assessment, and supporting the concept of bringing in that kind of appropriate expertise where it might be needed. And that might be internal kind of governmental expertise, or could be external expertise. And indeed, we were reminded that the GAC's own Human Rights and International Law Working Group already works with some organizations such as UNESCO and the Council of Europe who are able to bring these kind of perspectives into the GAC. So it was a useful conversation. I would say there were a number of sort of individual discussions about human rights, sub-sessions and workshops around the principles of how we do that kind of human rights assessment of some of the work that we do in ICANN.
Thank you so much, Susan. I do know that Sarah also wants to chime in on that topic. Sarah, please.
Thank you so much. This is Sarah again. Yeah, from the Registrar Stakeholder Group, this is a very important topic, and we're delighted to see that that the whole process has been changed to incorporate human rights. And what we're thinking about now is more, how does this work in reality, and how can we make sure that human rights are considered along with data protection rights? They really go hand in hand as the policy work is proceeding, rather than as an assessment that's done at the end of a process. But as recommendations are being considered, the effect on human rights needs to be considered as part of that. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Susan. Anyone else? Okay. Philip, shall we give it another try?
Yeah, happy to talk about review of reviews, as you were referring to it a moment ago, coded in the bylaws to make sure that ICANN is accountable, and they're referred to as reviews. There are a number of them that are mandatory, and the cadence of those reviews is mandatory as well. It's been difficult to handle within the community to manage. Some recommendations were not implemented. Some of the SGCs had difficulty providing volunteers for those reviews, and ultimately it became difficult for people to understand why we were eventually doing these things. So I think in the middle last year, we've all decided to have a holistic look at all of these things, and the term which was indeed chosen was review of reviews, which is not a very flattering one, arguably. But at ICANN 85, the group that's in charge of that task, which is called a cross-community group on review of reviews, did some sort of roadshow across the SDCs to describe their findings. And they essentially came up with 3 or 4 work tracks, 3 what they call buckets. One for the accountability and transparency reviews, which would be more on demand rather than mandatory, and the cadence of which would be more flexible. A second bucket would be related to things that are more lightweight and more focused on things that would pertain to one SO or one AC or their relationship, and that's called a continuous improvement program, incremental changes that we would want to do to these structures. One holistic approach, which is called a structural review, and another bucket that will deal with all the rest of the reviews, which is called ad hocs. The are very much focused on the third part of the structural review. The rationale for this is that we're corporate and commercial organizations, and most of us, if not all of us, have gone through a number of restructure over the years, and the reason for that is that it's almost built in the way we work. The reason for this is that we look at our ecosystem and consider whether it's fit for purpose, and we think that's just what the community should do moving forward, and consider whether we are still fit for purpose, or whether there are, for example, people who might not be represented, whether we've got a good structure within the community, and ultimately, given the nature of the review, that it should come first. So the work on this review of reviews is going on. The cross-community working group is collecting the inputs, and I believe the goal is to come up with by the AGM or the end of the year at the latest, if my memory serves me well. So with this and appreciating that you've got sound now, I'll be happy to take questions. I'll let you take questions, but over to you anyway, Thomas.
Thank you so much. If there are questions, let us know, then we're going to pick them up. But other than that, I do know that Frederick and Jordan would also like to speak to this topic. Frederick, you go first.
Yeah, Frederick speaking. Thank you, Thomas, and good summary, Philippe. So from the at-large perspective and the regional at-large organizations, we are for most unpaid or exclusively unpaid volunteers. So it's hard to have so many reviews, the structural reviews, etc. It's really too much. So the direction we have taken, all the regional at-large organizations, is really to focus on continuous improvement program. So much more, how to say, that's regular small work to improve, and at least we are thinking we are going in the right direction. That's really our focus. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Jordan.
Thanks, Thomas. And let me echo that. Thanks to you, Philippe, for the nice summary there. The CCNSO members discussed this at the meeting in Mumbai, and people are pretty happy with the way that it was being approached. I'm pleased that the CCNSO played a role in instigating this review of reviews, because the overlay of lots of processes happening at the same time and all the demands on volunteer time was really getting out of hand. There were no concerns really with the approach. People seem to welcome the way that the working group is going, so I would say keep going. And the only other thing I reflected on after our discussion, in the structural review proposal, that sort of column, which was C at one point, there were a couple of different options that the group was seeking feedback on. And one of the comments that I made in the CCNSO discussion was that to choose between the options, it really helps to nail down the purpose of each of the reviews in quite a specific way. So if you wanted to give the structural review the right to look into the details within an ICANN SO or AC, the purpose that would relate to was helping to ensure the effective organization of the ICANN system and all of its structures. Whereas if you just said that the purpose of the structural review is to look at the ICANN system in an holistic and high-level way, you probably wouldn't give that review the scope to delve into the details of what happens within specific SOs and ACs. So I think really clearly articulating the purpose of each of these types of review will help guide the community towards being able to give feedback on what the best way to implement it is. So I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I keep my fingers crossed for this exercise. I think that we've been overly ambitious with the review schedule when this was introduced 10 years back in the course of the IANA stewardship transition. That brings back fond memories for many of us, I guess. So I think we have to be realistic and make sure that we are not earning a reputation of reviewing ourselves to death, but just deliver on our core mission, produce sound policy, and do reviews where necessary in order to make sure that the organization is sufficiently accountable within and out from the outside. All right. So I do know that Nico needs to leave a few minutes earlier, which is why I would like us to move to ICP2 first. And with that, over to you, Philippe. You're going to introduce that topic as well.
Well, thank you, Thomas. Happy to do this. This is, in our view, one of the most important policies that ICANN has been developing for the last 3 years, if not the most. It's an effort by the ASO-AC, the Addressing Committee, and it's intended to review the policy that describes the recognition of a regional internet registry or the derecognition of an regional internet registry. So obviously it's crucial for ISPs in that particular region. It was originally triggered, not triggered, I should say, but in parallel to the difficulties that AFRINIC has been encountering. These are two separate tracks, but understandably people have seen some relationship between the two. Although the review of that policy was not meant to fix the situation in AFRINIC, now that the situation is improving, that update effort is more serene, I should say. That's an English word. So moving forward, I think the ISPs have had a session with the ASO on the update. I think the intent is to have it approved by the end of the year. I think the approval process is still being discussed, but ultimately there will be a way for the community to weigh in. Again, more on substance, I think the things that have been updated is on the implementation. And for those of you who are involved in the GNSO will appreciate that they understand that there's always a need to stay at a certain level when you define a policy and leave implement other things to implementation, given the very nature of that policy. There are things that are left to the regional level. That's one thing. There's also a new threshold in terms of the recognition of a regional internet registry, which is an important factor in sort of triggering, as well as the notion of a third party that is still being discussed in the audit of how well a regional internet registry fares in its mission. So the updates are on the way. They've been consulting across the board during that ICANN 85, and we think that they're very supportive of the effort and hope that this will be complete in due time. Thank you, Thomas. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Philippe. Nico.
Thank you so much. So on the matter of RIR's regional internet registries, and we provided, again, you have the official GAC position in that regard in writing in the communique, which is, again, publicly available, more specifically on page 11, now, if I recall correctly. But anyways, it's just a matter of checking it. So on this issue, we met with the ASO, with the Address Supporting Organization, to discuss the new governance document currently under development. It is my understanding. And our position is very clear. RIRs must operate their policies in the public interest. Very simple, very clear, and maintain the stewardship of internet number resources in a transparent and accountable manner. Those are the most important things I can mention at this point. We also emphasized that any final governance framework must align with ICANN's multi-stakeholder approach and include objective and measurable criteria for auditing RIR performance. A very important point that, in my humble opinion, should have been stressed like 20 years ago. But again, we can't go back 20, 25, 30 years ago and preview what. Anyways, again, for the sake of time, let me just mention that the GAC looks forward to reviewing the final version of this document to ensure it actually reflects these core public policy principles. And I'll stop there because I really have to go, and my apologies beforehand, but I have two meetings right now. But again, page 11, the GAC communicate, you have it in writing, very detailed and very specific for the sake of clarity. Thank you so much again, Thomas, and thank you, everyone. I need to drop at this point. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for joining, Nico. And I know that Jordan also needs to drop. Thank you to the two of you for making yourself available today and being our regular guest for this. That's awesome. We have one more topic.
See you all.
Take care. We have one more topic to cover, and that's the ISPCP outreach that we would like to briefly go through. And I do know that wants to speak to this as the ISPCP chair.
Thank you, Thomas, very quickly. Yes, indeed. The ICANN meetings are always a good opportunity for ISPs to reach out to the sort of local community, and we did just that we had a 3-hour outreach event with the ISPs from India, mostly, I should say, and a good turnout of, I think, 80 at some point, 80 participants, where we reviewed essentially one, unsurprisingly, about AI, which in this meeting, but both from, so AI has been discussed both in terms of, as you would expect, in terms of being a threat, but also as a tool to combat it on both sides of the equation. And we also discussed through the what's called the Code Initiative, which is something that the Coalition for Digital Inclusion put together by I believe, more focused on so it's slightly broader than UA. The second was UA for ISPs, with a focus on the impact on the back end, and not only ASCII characters are supported by our applications. And the last one was the sort of the readout of the findings of the expert group on the universal acceptance, and how we as a community, not only ISPs, but can use these recommendations to make sure that all formats, not only for domain names, but also emails, etc., are used by our systems. So unsurprisingly, the Indian community. Really interested in how we can move that forward. Some of you might have attended some demos in some of the other halls. So I'll stop here. I know a number of you are interested in UA as well. So mindful of time, I'll hand over to you, Thomas.
Thank you so much. And actually, it's quite stunning that so many years after the introduction of IDN TLDs as well as the new GTLD program, we're still seeing a lot of issues from the technical side of things to not force folks to use ASCII keywords or otherwise limit them to the ASCII world. I know that Frederick also wants to talk about UA as well as resilience. So Frederick, why don't you take the floor?
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. So indeed, universal acceptance is an important topic, and we have also the global stakeholder engagement team of ICANN have been made really altogether a fantastic job, I would say, together with the big techs, together with the developers community, and also with the different at-large community towards academic sectors to really have, as from the beginning, universal acceptance certifications so that people really entering in their professional life have already immediately universal acceptance in head. That's really something key is developed in different regions. And another thing that came also during the ICANN meeting in Mumbai is about the resilience of the internet. Even if it's not ICANN managing that alone, it's really our context we are, and it is really a growing topic, notably with the Security and Stability Advisory Committee. It was a side note to mention that. It's a topic that will, I think, increase in the coming years. Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you so much. That brings us to the end of our schedule. And before we adjourn, I'd like to give you, Gabi, the opportunity to say a few words or closing remarks if you wish. You don't have to, but...
I have actually been taking notes here, so it's not that I've been sleeping, but well, I can just thank everyone for their input, also for joining from different time zones and so on. And Thomas, I will take back your comment on a well-organized meeting to our meetings team. They will appreciate that feedback. But to everyone, thank you so much for all your work, sharing your insights. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Gabi. And for everyone else, if only the attendees could unmute their microphones, you would hear deafening applause now. So thank you so much for being part of this today. Thanks, Gabi, Susan, Frederick, Lars, for taking care of us from a technical point of view and organizing everything. Sarah and Philip, thanks so much. Have a great day. And this meeting is now adjourned.